So this is the second part of this week's unit on Russia. So in the previous notes, you learned a little bit about a little bit about how Russia was like, or the Soviet Union was like under communism. They were always in the United States' way, expanding around the world, trying to get other countries to be communist, trying to beat us to the moon, building the biggest and baddest nuclear weapons, and just terrifying us. And thankfully, communism didn't really work out in Russia, so they collapsed. And briefly, in the 90s, it looked like Russia was going to become a great ally, a great friend. They were democratically electing presidents. Their economy was growing. They were improving relations with us. Lots of Russian presidents and American presidents were friends. And then this guy in 2000 comes along named Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin used to be a spy for communist Russia, and he became president. Well, under the Russian Constitution, you can only be president for 6 years. Like here in the United States, our presidents have two-term limits, so 4 years plus 4 years equals 8 years. Well, in Russia, you can only be president for 6 years. Vladimir Putin has been president for 21 years. Which means he's not really a president, he's a dictator. He's manipulating the Russian Constitution to remain in power. The problem is, a lot of Russians like the guy, and so they don't mind it. But then a lot of Russians hate the guy, and they want him gone. The problem is, the people that hate him, he's got so much power now, he can just pretty much make them disappear, as you'll see in a moment. So, Vladimir Putin, you can argue, which I'm about to make that argument, is turning Russia into the old Russia of the past instead of the new Russia that was supposed to be good. So, anyway, let's begin. Keep in mind the introduction to U.S. Russian relations notes, that second part, lists 1, 2, 3, 4. You're supposed to list all the ways that Russia is turning into the old Russia and then say what the United States should do about it. For example, under the Trump administration, Trump was trying to be friends with Putin, and maybe if we were friends, then Russia would stop being so mean. Whereas Biden is taking a harder approach, saying we should put sanctions on Russia and draw a hard line and say, Russia, if you cross this line, NATO is going to get you in trouble, or we're gonna get you in trouble at the UN. So basically, just based on your knowledge of this class and what you've seen before or learned about before in this class, what do you think we should do about it after you've explained each one of these things I'm talking about? Well, the first thing that Russia is doing, that is going backwards instead of forwards, is the political interference. It says Russia has been accused of meddling in democratic affairs across many democratic nations. For example, there is strong evidence that Russia, under Putin, was interfering in the election of Donald Trump, trying to hack into our voting booths, trying to make him win the first term, not the second one, but the first one. Because Putin and Trump, without a doubt, were friends. They were allies with each other, despite Putin being anti-American. So, I mean, you can argue all day long about Trump's reasoning for this. The liberals say that, or the Democrats and the liberals say that Trump and Putin were friends because Putin made a deal with Trump saying, hey, I'm going to help you win the election, even if we have to cheat. And if I help you win, you have to do everything Russia says. You have to pretty much be my pet, according to the Democrats. Whereas the Republicans say that Putin is a very conservative guy. It would be a Republican himself, arguably, and that he's not so bad as the liberals make him out to be, and that Trump was right in his efforts to create friendly relations with Putin. You can believe whatever you want. But the evidence does not lie that there was some interference in the 2016 election of Trump by the Russians, especially with social media. There's these things in Russia called troll farms, where Russia hires, or there's evidence, I should say, of these things called troll farms. That squeaking noise you might hear is my golden retriever squeaking his bone because I'm not paying attention, or his toy because I'm not paying attention to him. Winston, go lay down. Go lay down. Anyway, so Russia was accused of creating these troll farms where thousands and thousands of Russians were being paid by the government to post fake news online about Hillary Clinton and all these slanderous and statements about how Hillary Clinton is, this really bad person. All these lies that a lot of Americans fell for. Same with Brexit. So it was in Russia's interest to make it so that the United Kingdom or Great Britain separated from the EU, because the more the EU is divided up, the less powerful the EU is against Russia. So Russia wants the EU to collapse. Russia wants the EU to break apart. So there was also evidence that Russia made a lot of fake news about why Great Britain should vote to leave the EU. A lot of conservative EU politicians won elections. I shouldn't say that. I should say there is evidence that a lot of them are winning elections because of Putin's interference, and just unimaginable amounts of fake news is being created by Russia. For example, a lot of grandma's Facebook posts talk about how you have to be a Republican, or you have to be a Republican in order to be a good Christian. For example, that Jesus would be a Republican. A lot of those are created by Russia to try to convince people to identify more with Vladimir Putin's political motives. So a lot of the things on Facebook were handmade by Russian trolls in order to convince people to vote in his favor. Now, I should be very careful when I say this, because a lot of Republicans don't like Putin. It just there's more Republicans that like Putin than liberals or Democrats, but at the same time, not all Republicans are pro-Putin. I should make that very clear. But there are a lot more Republicans that are on his side than Democrats. So let's look at this video here.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team, along with America's top intelligence agencies, have demonstrated one clear fact. The Russian government meddled in the 2016 presidential election. This is the first glimpse we got into Russia's interference in the election. It's the summer of 2016, and hacked and stolen emails from the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee are publicly released, some via the website WikiLeaks. Cybersecurity experts quickly suggest Russians were behind the hack, but no evidence is provided. Candidate Donald Trump routinely downplayed suggestions that Russia was interfering.
It could be Russia, but it could also be China. It could also be lots of other people. It also could be somebody sitting on their bed that weighs 400 pounds, okay?
As the presidential campaign continues in the fall of 2016, American intelligence officials brief members of Congress that the Russian government is looking to interfere in the election. In September, at the G20 meeting in China, President Obama reportedly warns Russian President Vladimir Putin to stop his nation's interference. 2 months later, Donald Trump wins the presidency. But before his inauguration, the Obama administration publicly points the finger at Russia for the Clinton email hack, and in retaliation, levies sanctions on Russia and expels 35 Russian nationals from the U.S. The next month, a declassified intelligence report written with input from the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA states that Vladimir Putin personally ordered a cyber and social media campaign to disrupt the recent U.S. presidential election. And it states that Putin had a clear preference for Donald Trump. According to the report, Putin, quote, aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him. In February of 2018, Robert Mueller's first indictment against the Russians drops.
The indictment charges 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian companies for committing federal crimes while seeking to interfere in the United States political system.
Mueller's team lays out a sweeping case, directly accusing Russian citizens and companies of a massive, coordinated disinformation campaign to sabotage the election.
The defendants allegedly conducted what they called information warfare against the United States, with the stated goal of spreading distrust towards the candidates and the political system in general.
The indictment accuses the Russians who worked out of this building in Moscow of stealing American identities, setting up fake accounts on Facebook and other social media sites, and spreading false and inflammatory information. According to the indictment, their work isn't limited to the internet. Russians allegedly traveled across the U.S., hid their identities, and staged political rallies. The indictment also confirms the Russians had a favored candidate. Quote, by early to mid-2016, defendants' operations included supporting the presidential campaign of then-candidate Donald J. Trump and disparaging Hillary Clinton. 5 months later, another Mueller indictment. 12 more Russians are indicted by Mueller's team, including members of the GRU, a unit of Russian military intelligence. That's their headquarters. They're accused of hacking and stealing the Democratic National Committee and Clinton campaign emails.
The goal of the conspirators was to have an impact on the election.
None of the Mueller indictments thus far have indicated that any member of the Trump campaign was involved or aware of this meddling in the election.
So as you can see, there is strong evidence that Russia is, in fact, interfering with our democracy by making fake news and just harassing the political opponents that Putin does not like. So Putin is using our own democracy against us, it can be argued. So there's the first thing they're doing, like the old Russia, and the new Russia is also doing this, what the old Russia used to be doing. They're expanding. It says Russia has been wanting to expand under Putin. So Russia used to own a huge chunk of the world. In 1991, they gave all of those countries back to themselves, I guess. And so all those countries won their independence from the communist Russians, and now Russia is showing evidence that they want them back. Countries like in Eastern Europe. So anyway, in the last 10 years, they've annexed parts of Georgia, which is a country, not a state, and Ukraine, which is used to be an old part of Russia. And they've threatened nearby non-NATO nations like Finland, for example. So if you remember what NATO was in the last slide, the alliance system, some countries that border Russia, like Finland, for example, and Ukraine, are thinking about joining NATO because they're afraid Russia is going to invade them today. And Russia has threatened these countries, if you join NATO, there's going to be consequences. So they're trying to scare their border countries who aren't a part of NATO into not becoming a part of NATO, because the bigger NATO is, the weaker Russia gets. So, evidence that they have expanded. All of these light red countries used to be a part of Russia. In 1991, they gave them all back. Same with these. So this used to be the Soviet Union. Today, if you just see this border here, this is all Russia is today, right here where it says the Soviet Union. But they used to own all the countries in color. So recently, the Soviet Union has threatened Ukraine, they've threatened Georgia, and they've threatened a lot of these Baltic countries here. So in 2014, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula right here. And it was an event that really shocked the world. It looked like World War II, Russia rolling into this independent country and taking a huge chunk of land from them. Today, Russia still has occupied this part of Ukraine. So here's a video of that invasion.
Most coaches believe that if only they could change the beliefs of their clients, then they could change their life.
Blessed by nature, beset with contention. This is Crimea. It's 3 years since Russia annexed the peninsula from Ukraine, pushing east and west into a new Cold War. Today, Moscow is cementing its presence with a bridge that will bind Crimea to the Russian mainland. With its military, too, Russia's moved its most powerful weapons here. And wherever you go in Crimea, you're left in no doubt who's in charge. Olga Koziko welcomes Russian rule. Crimea, she says, has returned home. She chides Western leaders who disagree.
We don't understand them because we are already for 3 years we're in Russia. We changed everything. We changed our rules, our documents, everything. And our soul is in Russia. And I even have the T-shirt with Putin, and the words are, "In Putin we trust," like in God we trust.
Moscow admits its takeover of Crimea was a military operation. It sent Russian special forces here. Days later, after a referendum not recognized internationally, Crimea was declared part of Russia. Svetlana Gavrilenko had opposed the annexation, but 3 years on, her perspective on Russia has changed.
They were expecting us. They were happy to have us back. Ukraine are not. They really hate us. They think everyone here is a traitor. Even if though you were ever pro-Ukrainian or you're now pro-Ukrainian, you're still a traitor because you didn't leave.
America's position hasn't changed. The White House says it expects Moscow to return Crimea. It's almost inconceivable that Vladimir Putin would perform a U-turn on Crimea and hand this peninsula back to Ukraine. For one thing, the Kremlin doesn't do U-turns. And reclaiming this land for Russia, well, President Putin will regard that as part of his legacy. And Moscow insists that most of the people who live here are happy to be in Russia. But not everyone is. Since annexation, the Crimean Tatar community has come under pressure. Its governing body, which had opposed the 2014 referendum, has been banned. Human rights groups accuse Moscow of creating a climate of repression. Umer Ibragimov is desperate for information about his son, Ervin. A Tatar activist, Ervin was abducted 10 months ago. CCTV cameras caught the moment he was seized by men in uniform. Not knowing where his son is driving Umer to despair. His heart, he told me, isn't made of steel, but you can see that. And yet this Crimean spring feels calmer than 3 years ago. Most people here don't think about sovereignty or sanctions. They try to get on with their lives. They can't predict the future, so navigating the present is fine for now. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Crimea.
So when Russia was invading Crimea, this is just a side note, this Malaysian flight was going from the Netherlands to Malaysia. It's a long flight. And they were flying over Ukraine at over 30,000 feet, which is really high. And the Russians thought that this plane full of people was a spy plane from Ukraine. And so they shot a missile at it and blew the plane out of the sky, killing everyone on board. Hundreds of people died. Russia finally admitted to this just a few years ago. There was wreckage for a mile. The third thing that they're doing, besides expanding, is political censorship. So Russia has free speech. Under their constitution, Russia has free speech, just like us. However, Putin has been cracking down on criticism. So you technically have free speech in Russia, but if you say anything about Putin, you might disappear. Just like you saw in the last video. People are disappearing. The government is taking people and either killing them, making it look like, an accident, or just making them disappear. So journalists who oppose Putin often go missing or are murdered. So this guy here was a Russian who said some bad things about Putin, and then he was living in Great Britain, And a Russian spy actually tracked this guy down in England and poisoned him with radiation. And it was shocking to the world that Russia was able to infiltrate an independent, powerful nation like Great Britain and poison someone like this. And then all these journalists here, these are Russian journalists. Every single one of them have been murdered by Putin's men or have disappeared. So let's watch.
58. Still beautiful.
Vladimir Putin begins his fourth term as Russian president this morning. Putin was sworn in during a ceremony marking his 18th year in power. Protesters opposed to his lengthy rule clashed with police over the weekend. Officers arrested more than 1,500 people. Elizabeth Palmer is in Moscow with the issues Putin faces this term. Elizabeth, good morning.
Good morning. Well, this year the Kremlin had announced that the inauguration was going to be low-key. But from what we saw, there was still plenty of pomp and ceremony. This is the fourth time Vladimir Putin has taken the presidential oath of office. Fittingly enough, he addressed the nation from what was 100 years ago the throne room of the Tsars in the Kremlin Palace. His message emphasized tradition and family values as well as strength. As head of state, he said, "I will do everything to multiply Russia's power." The ceremony was elaborately choreographed, with military salutes and a meet and greet to highlight his popularity with young people. Not all young people, though. On Saturday, there were demonstrations across the country called by the opposition leader Alexei Navalny against what he calls the rigged elections that gave Putin another term. "Down with the Tsar," the crowd chanted, before police moved in, arrested Navalny, and then dispersed his supporters. There were similar clashes across the country, the Kremlin's way of harassing any kind of anti-Putin protests. And although more than 1,000 people were arrested, none of it was carried on the main Russian TV news. Now, the analysts that we've been talking to in Moscow say that a new term doesn't mean a new Putin. We're going to be seeing more of the same. That is, an authoritarian government at home with plenty of corruption, and abroad, an aggressive Putin who will continue to attack Western democracies with disinformation and cyber weapons. Vlad?
Elizabeth Palmer in Moscow. Thanks, Elizabeth.
So those people protesting were very brave, because a lot of people are going missing who criticize Putin. And finally, we have proxy wars. Now, I never explained what this was. I think I did briefly, actually. But a proxy war is where, even today, the United States and Russia cannot go to war. There's no way. If we go to war, we will all be vaporized, probably before we even get the news. So we have these things called proxy wars, where a country goes through a civil war, Russia takes one side, we take the other side, and Russia stands on the sidelines like a coach, and we stand on the sideline like a coach, and we launch a war with each other in that country without going to war together, if that makes sense. So, for example, you know about the Syrian civil war. Putin and Assad here are friends. A lot of Syrians want this guy out of power. Putin and him are friends. They're both dictators, and a lot of the Syrian people want the guy dead. You know, they want him removed from power, and they want to establish democracy in Syria. So we take the sides of the Syrian rebels who want democracy, and Putin takes the sides of the loyalists, the guy that want to keep the dictator in power. And then we go to war with each other like that. Winston. So that's a proxy war. It used to be this way with Afghanistan, like you learned when we were talking about 9/11 with Russia. It used to be this way with Vietnam, and soon you'll talk about the Korean War. So we have been to war with Russia several times. We just used other countries to fight each other, and we take one side and they take the other. So this is still happening. So in Syria, we kind of saw that again, a proxy war. All right, so that's it. complete that worksheet correctly. Rewatch this if you need to. Hopefully you took some notes. And remember to take the final weekly quiz.